and welcome everybody to the first of the Conservative Middle East Council's events in our debate series for Conservative Party Conference 2023. I'm Charlotte Leslie and I'm the Director of the Conservative Middle East Council. CMEC was set up more than 40 years ago under Margaret Thatcher by Lord Carrington to help Conservative parliamentarians and others understand this nuanced and complex region a little bit better and to build relationships that last decades, not days. It's a pleasure to have you with us in this, albeit slightly bouncy castle Teletubbies conference venue. Pleasure to see you nonetheless. We've seen an expansion of BRICS both in remit and influence. We've seen a Saudi-Iran rapprochement and an ever more diplomatic and active China. We ask ourselves, what relevance and how does the UK and the West maintain relevance in this changing world and in the Middle East and North Africa, both today and into the future? Here to discuss that this afternoon, I'm very pleased to welcome two world-leading experts. On the end, we have Sir John Jenkins, who has been British Ambassador to Syria, Iraq, Libya and Saudi Arabia. So there's very little this man does not know about diplomacy and the wider region. I'm also delighted to welcome Mina Al-Oraibi, who is the editor of the national newspaper based in Abu Dhabi and is a British-Iraqi journalist. Mina and John, welcome. Thank you very much for being with us. To kick off, I'm going to ask you, first John and then Mina, just to run through very briefly, perhaps in 5 minutes, where you see the UK's influence in the Middle East today and North Africa today, including Middle East, North Africa, UK, the West and NATO, and where you see it going in the future. John, over to you first.
Okay, thank you, Charlotte. I was in the Foreign Office actually 2 or 3 months ago, and a senior official said we've got 3 questions. One is how do we rebuild the British image in the Middle East? The second question is our support for a two-state solution in Israel and Palestine doing us more harm than good? And the third one was what lessons do we learn from the Arab Spring? And I said, well, the first thing to do is to ask better questions. Because the way these questions are framed actually is assume a sort of a view of the Middle East and North Africa, which is outdated. I mean, a lot of these issues either don't exist in the form they existed, or they exist in a completely different way to the way they did 15, 20 years ago. And in terms of the question of the British image or the British position in the Middle East, the first question you have to ask is what are we for in the region? And when I first went to the region in the early 1980s, I think we still looked at a lot of the states in the region, particularly in the Gulf, as sort of semi-client states. These are states that had been part of Britain's colonial or imperial reach. The Emirates was only 12 years old when they first went to Abu Dhabi. Bahrain was the same, Kuwait was 10 years older, but they were all very young. And they were building the institutions of state quite often from scratch or nearly scratch. It's completely different now in the Gulf. This is partly a function of generations. It's partly a function of the way in which institutions have been built. It's partly a result of economics. And the way that power in general around the world has shifted and become more fragmented. Now, I'm not saying that we live in a completely multipolar world, because I don't think we do. I think the United States remains a hyperpower. But I think we've seen the rise of alternative power centers, particularly in China and to a certain extent India. And I think that relationship with China, in particular, which we'll talk about, I guess, later, represents an inflection point. And represents an inflection point for all sorts of reasons. But if you're in the Gulf, it represents an inflection point because that's where your oil and gas exports go. They go east, they go west, they go north. And I think we're seeing a new age of confidence as well in large parts of the world. Not all. I think the Great Levant, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq are in deep trouble because they have been formed into deeply fractured states, highly corrupt states. I think Egypt has severe economic problems, but the states of the Gulf, I think, are doing well, and they have a new generation of leadership. And I think the way that they look at the world is very different from the way that their predecessors looked at the world. I think that we need to understand this much better than we do at the moment. I think there is another aspect to this, which is that the overhang of the invasion of Iraq and indeed Afghanistan remains very powerful. When I was in Iraq as ambassador between 2009 and 2011, I found it incredibly difficult to get ministers interested in anything to do with Iraq. And a lot of that was because Iraq had become a politically toxic issue domestically. I think that has, in many ways, disabled the power of initiative within the Foreign Office and indeed at a higher level within ministerial circles. And I think that is a problem, because unless you're prepared to put political power, political oomph behind a policy, it won't work. So we do a lot of things on the hoof because ministers and the wider political class, and indeed the British electorate, have been distracted by other things. I think lastly, Brexit clearly had an impact because of the way in which it affected the way in which governments in this country have had to behave or found themselves behaving over the last 5 or 6 years. And I think it's been pretty chaotic. I think trying to form coherent policy in those circumstances, especially when domestic politics has become so, in many ways, so polarized, and you still have the aftermath of Iraq and Afghanistan, is problematic. I think some of these also apply to the United States. I think you can tell an analogous story about France with the collapse of the French position in West Africa and the Sahel. You're seeing again the unwinding of a traditional network of clientships and relationships. So there's a whole range of things happening across the Western world. They're happening in different ways in different places.
Thank you very much, John. Mina, can I ask for a perspective on us from where you stand in the region?
Thank you, Charlotte. It's lovely to be here. I haven't attended one of these in about 10 years or so it's quite interesting to see the dynamic. Just following up what John was saying, that the Middle East has changed, North Africa has changed, as has Britain. The world has changed in the last 20 years. Of course, the Iraq War, the 20th anniversary of the Iraq War, and the ramifications are still being felt today. I think that people in the region are not sure what the UK stands for. UK has failed in the last at least 5 years to really explain what British strategic interests look like. The Brexit conversation became all-encompassing for everything, and it was hard for people outside of the whole European dynamic to understand what Britain wanted or prioritized, and I think that's something that is still unclear. If we were talking history, there's the continuum, Suez, what happens post-Suez, and then of course the Iraq War, but really today, most people in the region, particularly young people, don't really care about that. They want to see whether the beacons of light around the world. And I think traditionally you would have, my parents' generation would look to the UK as such. I don't believe they would see people my generation or younger would see it that way. I'd say the Arab world has had different experiences with Britain, but the general sense is they know us. They know what the Arab world was like. And I don't know if you get the same feeling in 10 years or 15 years, but traditionally there's been a sense the Brits know us probably more than definitely more than Americans, and probably more than the French, because I think the colonial experience of France was very, very different. I would say there are 5 drivers today of the relationship with the Arab world. And this is, again, coming from the region, how you see it as, again, somebody who knows the UK intimately. Number 1, of course, is security. And security has been a huge driver, continues to be an important driver, especially when it comes to the Gulf countries, Jordan, to a lesser extent to Iraq, but really there's that security paradigm, and of course that brings in everything from weapon systems, the relationship wider with the UK and the US. Second is trade, hugely important. The UAE, where I'm based, just last year, £23.1 billion of bilateral trade. The GCC figures, I couldn't find the most up-to-date, but in 2019 it was 41.4 billion pounds, and it's definitely expanded since then. And of course, all eyes are now on the possibility of a free trade agreement. So through that, that's actually much clearer in terms of trade, but in terms of also investments coming into the UK. But of course, that is all with a historical background. So everything from Misbel in Iraq, the Balfour Declaration, Sudan, Yemen. There's a lot of this historical context that, again, the general average person might not care so much about, but it's definitely a backdrop. And that leads us to the political. So the UK is still hugely important as a member of the UN Security Council. The UK is a pen holder on major issues, including when it comes to the GCC. And so that maintains that relationship, even if it's taken for granted at a superficial level, those ties are still very strong. And then importantly, the cultural ties, educational institutions, still hugely important. So I think that often when we look at the politics, and we often talk about the problems of not seeing a coherent British strategy when it comes to geopolitics and with its strategic interests, those underlying historical, cultural, educational ties are very much there and still strong and should be nurtured. And I think, again, in the last few years, haven't gotten the attention they deserve. There are questions about British complacency and a lack of commitment. At the moment, there is a change in the FCDO and not having, just one minister that's sole and focus is the Middle East, North Africa. It seems to have been divvied out. Lord Ahmed, plays a role, but not the same as before, where we had one address, one person that people would come to. They had strong relationships. I think that's had an impact. But importantly, the earthquake of the withdrawal from Afghanistan. I think often when people talk about the Middle East and North Africa, they don't think about Afghanistan. They think it's separate, but it really isn't separate. And to this day, there is a sense of, again, a lack of coherence. Now, this is the shadow of the U.S. This is very much reflected on the U.S., but it then also reflects on the U.K. because of the close partnership, the role that they both have. I'd say one final thing is there is an appreciation in the Middle East, North Africa region that the general public in the UK isn't too concerned with what's happening in the region. And because of this kind of internal dynamic that's happened in the last 5 years or so, there's an understanding that it's hard to get the attention of ministers, it's hard to get the attention of people because they're thinking about what's the next election, what do our constituencies care about. And at the national, we just did a poll with Delta Poll from the 11th to the 15th of September, trying to poll the British public on matters of international affairs. And of course, you can imagine most people are not that interested. And that's having a reflection. I mean, here it's long-term decisions for a brighter future, but it feels like we're not getting longer-term decisions because there's this polling and focus groups. And what do they say about the region? There's a general sense that they're not interested. What we did find, I'm going to just share a couple of the statistics that we found, is that 46% of 18 to 24-year-old Brits are quite interested in the fact that Saudi Arabia is putting money into sports and football, and they think it's a positive thing. So 46% think it's positive, which we thought was quite interesting. But yet again, 33% didn't actually know much about it and weren't that interested. There was 47% support for the UAE investments in renewables. So again, going back to that trade point, but 31% didn't even know about it. So there is a sense that if you're, again, British trade minister and you're thinking about these things, if you are going to be focused on what does the electorate think, you probably would not doing a good job of educating them enough about these things. However, I will say that we found 56% of those we polled saw Iran as a threat to the UK and the world, and 11% saw it as a threat, but not to the UK. And I thought that was quite interesting, that the Iranian nuclear issue is one of the few that actually gets attention. And 59% see China as a threat. And as we will talk about now, as China's influence grows in the region, it really is something that perhaps the Brits see as a threat, but most people in the region would say, please don't start treating this as a threat, and let's think about what the world looks like in the next 5, 10, 20 years.
Mina, thank you very much. And I should say we're going to have a discussion here, and there will be an opportunity towards the end of the session for audience Q&A. So I know you're probably going to have lots of questions. Bear with us. Mina, if I can just pick up on something that you said, people don't know what the UK stands for. Do you think the UK knows what it stands for? And I'll ask the same to John.
I think often as journalists, we say the UK and we mean the government, but it's really as a country. I think individuals have their own idea of what their country means for them, but I think that wider narrative point that's coming from the government or from diplomats is unclear. So I think you're probably right. They probably don't know what they stand for.
Yeah, I think the level of white noise out there, I think politics in general, the West has become more tribal, more divisive, and less more united. And the way in which commentary is raised, means there's a lot of static out there. And there is nobody leading a discussion about what the story is, what the national story is, and what it is to be Britain in the world. This isn't just about Brexit. This goes back actually quite a long way, I think. We were talking about this in the forum when I was still in the forum office, about, when we were talking about the strategy of various other things. What is it that we do in the world? We can answer that now, if you like. And I think one of the issues is to do with knowledge of the world. I think this issue, that came up in the poll that you did. I mean, it's interesting. I don't know if the 33% who weren't interested in UAE money were all Manchester United fans. It's all Liverpool fans, perhaps. I don't know. It's probably a bad place to say that, but it's. I think the level of I think people are so preoccupied with other things at the moment that it's very hard to think about what it is to be Britain in the world. And I think the days when the Western powers, when the powers have set the agenda globally, have gone. It's not that we don't have a role in doing this. In a sense, we're still a member of one of the permanent members of the UN Security Council. We're still a major economy, a major military power, and the rest of it. We just haven't decided what it is, how we use that power. Some of this, in terms of the Middle East, is understanding, I think, what the Middle East and North Africa represents now. Because you have, in the end, you have to work with partners. And this issue about partnership in the Middle East is actually itself quite divisive. You look at the debate about Saudi Arabia, for example, about what sort of relationship we, or the United States, or France, or whoever, should have with Prince Mohammed bin Salman and the new Saudi Arabia. It's often quite a sharp debate. I mean, people say, talk about human rights and all this sort of stuff. But Saudi Arabia is not one man. Saudi Arabia is always a whole set of different things. And it is too important to the region, and therefore, in my view, to us, to the world, to be simply put aside as a country you can't have a proper relationship with, which is something you've seen in the United States. So whether the Biden administration's position on Saudi Arabia has evolved from President Biden saying, is polite, Saudi Arabia should be polite, to the fist bump and then the last meeting. So it's you've got to have, and some of this is about the nature of the diplomatic service itself, and that's the sort of representation you have in the region.
I was going to ask, do you think, here's a narrative, tell me if you agree with it. Back when history had ended, around 2006 I think it was, we thought history might have ended, and we believed that, perhaps the West believed that exporting our liberal democratic values was the right thing to do, because it was the right thing for everybody else. And a sense of national self-interest became kind of a dirty word. That's not something we do because we're enlightened and we don't like to think of our own self-interest, we think about others. But of course, self-interest is the basic building block of diplomacy. If I know, even if I don't think your self-interest is very enlightened, John, I can negotiate with you because I think you do have a sense of self-interest. Mina, do you think that's the case? Do people think that the UK has lost a sense of self-interest? Is it a dirty word, and should it be?
I think people outside of the UK are a bit more cynical. I don't think they think that the UK stopped caring for its self-interest and was trying to export good things to the world. Perhaps the UK likes to think of itself that way, as do the Americans, but I think that's one of the problems, actually. This kind of idea that somehow 3 or 4 countries hold a higher moral ground than everybody else, and therefore everybody should fall in line, could have potentially held ground if Iraq and Afghanistan had gone in different ways. Most people were cynical that they could, but then it was, proof in the pudding that that's not the case. So I think that's part of the problem, is trying to pretend that there isn't self-interest. I think the UK and every country should work in its interest and the interest of its people, and always did, but tried to give this veneer that, most people didn't buy. And so now it's like, okay, can we go back to realpolitik and have a serious conversation about why actually your interest, whoever that country is, and Britain's interest meeting is good for the world. And I think, it's a case of globalization also. this, again ties in very strongly to a moment when the, WTO was seen as the premier organization. It was going to be open trade, open borders. UK no longer stands for open trade, open borders. And I agree with you. I don't think it all started with Brexit, but I think Brexit crystallized when people are like, for outsiders, this is a conversation that we don't even really understand or want to be part of if you're a non-European country. And so I think that image that it's no longer open to the world, despite the efforts of other prime ministers to talk about global Britain, it didn't really catch on because, again, what is the UK's self-interest in global Britain at a time when there's much more an image of borders going up rather than being open to the world?
John, so do we have self-interest but dress it up in other stuff, or have we got a rather occluded sense of our own self-interest?
Well, I think we've been through a quarter of a century of simple-minded moralism, quite honestly. And I think it goes back, maybe certainly back to Robin Cook's speech in whatever it was, 1998, when he talks about an ethical foreign policy, whatever the hell that means. Foreign policy has never really been. Foreign policy is as ethical as foreign policy can be. It was never. People will try to do the right thing, but in the end, the responsibility of government is to its own people, not to the world. Now, you can argue that actually you serve your people best by serving certain principles externally, which is true. So it's not nice to cozy up to dictators, to Hitler, to Stalin, to whoever and the rest of it. There has been a sense in which people thought the Middle East, at various points, certain things in the Middle East have been analogous. I think Saddam, no, but Saddam was a bad man. On the other hand, you overthrow Saddam and you remove a bulwark against Iran. The removal of Saddam is the thing that enabled Iran to colonize Iraq and later on Syria, and then join that up with Lebanon. And what you see in Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq are states which have been subordinated to the interests of armed groups within those states, and in the case of Syria, to a certain extent, Lebanon as well, are becoming narco-states linked into a much wider global network of criminal activity. Is that a good thing? No, it's a disastrous thing. Do I think it's a good thing that Saddam was good? Yeah, yes. On the other hand, the idea you root Saddam and democracy breaks out, it's for the words. It's not going to happen like it never is going to happen like that. And we stop paying attention. I think that as part of the problem. It's the same in Libya in 2011. You get rid of the war, and then what? You really do have to think about what happens after. Now, and I think if you look at the way we understood the Arab Spring for me was never about democracy. Some of it was about accountability, it was about people wanting agency in their own lives, and to a certain extent equality. A lot of it was about good governance, much better governance, having governments that produce services, security, services, jobs, and a better life. And I think we understood, I think as we've really widespread before, this as a cry for Western models of democracy in the region. Western models of democracy, it's not that people in the region want democracy, any sort of democracy, Western models definitely about it. But we misunderstand. And now you see what's happening in the Gulf, in Saudi Arabia, or whatever you think about what happened in Salman. He's incredibly popular among the young Saudis. And most people in the Middle East are young. They're between the ages of 19 or 35, depending on which country you're in. This is a target audience. What do they want? Actually, you can tell to a certain extent what they want, because there is public. There is the Arab barometer, there is Astabasta survey of Arab youth, which comes in every year, which is heavily weighted towards the Gulf, but it's still an indication. And there's polling of other people. You can by and large tell. But what they want is not a bunch of guys with turbans and beards and telling them what to do. But they want a better life, they want certain social freedoms, they want jobs, they want economic growth, they want a sense of purpose, they want a sense of pride in the country. All the things you see in Saudi Arabia. And yet people argue about what is our relationship with Saudi Arabia. So there's a sort of dysfunctional way of thinking about these issues, which we still haven't got over. So you need a hard-headed approach to understanding what your interests are. And our interests are served by helping people in the region get those good things that they all want. That's where we need to position ourselves.
And if I can just follow up on that, completely agreed. And this idea of good governance, legitimacy through competence, that people want competent governance that can deliver, and I don't think that's too different from anywhere in the world, right? So this idea of, but competence requires transparency and requires accountability, and those are the things, again, that the UK is respected for. And I think that there is a lot that the UK offers in terms of transparency, rule of law, and all of these kind of basic principles that people respect. And it's unfortunate that when we say democracy, most people now are like, well, what does democracy deliver and so forth. But I think we got so hung up on the term rather than talking about, well, actually, what does it provide, and what freedoms are guaranteed to people, and what do those freedoms look like? And unfortunately, in the Middle East, actually, the freedom to be safe, that in itself almost became impossible. And that's what people are looking for. Somewhere where I can raise my kids and they're safe. And somewhere where I can provide good hospitals and healthcare. And that, again, is something that people look to the UK, look to other countries, and say, what do those systems look like, and how can we learn?
Can I just add one thing to that? I mean, it's interesting in Iraq. When after 2003, one of the consequences of the invasion and the massive insecurity violence happened is that families were not sending their kids, and particularly their girls, to school. And I think, this is, you talk to families, they want their kids to be able to go to school and get an education, have a better life than they do the parents everywhere. That is not possible in terms of when the place is insecure and stable. Security is a fundamental building block for everything else that follows from that. It's not the end state, but you have to have that before anything else can happen. So, part of the Middle East is not a particularly stable place, but if you want to get with a project, you have to help people build that sort of societal stability and security.
And it's in the UK's interest to have a secure and stable Middle East, and that's clear. And again, it's in people's interest there. So there are moments like that where, that's why I said the security element is actually such a big part of when people look to Britain or look to relationships that they want to have with countries, is about, let's have safety and stability first, and then build up from that. And again, education, hugely important. The British Council is probably one of the most important symbols of the UK outside of the UK. And unfortunately here, most people are like, they roll their eyes at it, they're not interested. But actually, hugely important, hugely symbolic. DFID, now gone, but again, had, in our world, DFID only worked in Yemen, actually, but yet had such a big, and the West Bank, right, that's right. So those, but again, that had such a big reputation because people realize this is, again, Britain providing aid, so forth, but thinking long-term development. And there's respect for that.
And I'm sure the audience here knows the British Council very well, but if you don't, I really would encourage you to look at the work that they do, because it is quite exceptional, and I think epitomises, a bit like the BBC World Service, a lot of what people have respected in Britain. Now, I'm going to give you a very, very simplistic narrative that I've heard when I've been in the region. And it's a narrative I think may have come to Britain's attention as we see in the Russia-Ukraine war that perhaps our allies and friends in the Gulf region have not been in the position that we might have thought they'd have been on Russia-Ukraine, and either been neutral or more Russia-leaning than we may have hoped or thought. Here's the narrative, and I'm not saying that I agree with it at all. Look, people say, we like to send our kids to school in the UK, we want to have a life of freedom, we want to have a life that feels like life in the West. So you guys are kind of our natural allies, but you guys make it really hard for us. You kind of treat your friends like your enemies and then mistake your enemies for friends. And actually, Russia and China, although we might not want to live under that kind of lifestyle, are much easier allies. They don't lecture us the whole time. If they say they're going to do something, they do it. Because there's not democracy, there is generally a leader around for a very long time, so there's a bit of predictability. What are we supposed to do? How accurate is that narrative, Mina?
Again, depends who you talk to. I think it has holes in it. And I'll say, I think part of that narrative also, especially when it came to Ukraine and the relationship with Russia, is that Russia shouldn't be completely isolated, and then we try to work things out. And I think there were moments when it was the foreign fighter exchange that happened, when there were moments where you needed interlocutors. I felt like if we shut down our doors, then it's very hard to find that mediation room. So I think that's one thing. Second, again, when it came to Ukraine, and we were just having this conversation, there's a real sense of don't lecture us about the international order, because the international order has been breached by the US and the UK at times. So please, let's not do this based on moral grounds, but let's talk about this is a disaster. And nobody thought in the region, I have not spoken to a single person who thought, great move by Russia, that's what the world needed. I mean, everyone was like, this is a disaster. But how do we react to it? And what do we say in public and what do we say in private? Two different things. So I think there's and you did say that it's a simplistic, it's a complex narrative. But so if the Ukraine kind of story, I think, is much more complex than is just the Gulf is saying that's fine to Russia. They're really not, and I think that's very, very clear for everyone I've spoken to. However, the wider point of the relationship with Russia and China and this thing of it's more coherent. We know what they want. We know what we want. And yes, short-termism. Before, especially, and again, sometimes how the U.S. is viewed is reflected on the U.K. In the U.S., foreign policy was generally bipartisan, and it didn't matter if the Republicans and Democrats came in. The bigger picture story was similar. That's changed. That's completely changed now. And so I think there's the same now in the UK that they, especially I think with Labour Party, when Jeremy Corbyn was the leader, they thought that if there was a Labour Party that came in under Jeremy Corbyn, it would completely upend all the traditional relationships that were there. And so there's a sense of we don't know who we're dealing with and what they're going to be like in 4 or 5 years. So I think that long term versus short term has absolutely impacted how the alliances are being built.
I agree with everything you said. People talk about the relationship with the Gulf states now or with Russia and China as if this is a deliberate choice. This is a political choice. We're doing it to get back at Biden. But I don't think it's true. There may be some collateral damage to the region, but they're doing it because the Saudis have decided it's Saudi interest first. And the same with the Emirates. We're putting ourselves first. And of course, for Saudi in particular, the dash for economic restructuring through Vision 2030 is huge. They need oil at 90, probably over $100 a barrel actually to get this done. The relationship with Russia is massively important. The relationship that Prince Abdulaziz has with the Russian energy people, massively important in managing the global energy markets. I do think this is ultimately a short-term fix, because ultimately oil will hit $50 a barrel at some point in the future, and that will be a problem for Saudi be able to its current spending commitments. But they're doing it because of what's happening inside the kingdom, not because they want to get back at the United States. We interpret, and this has been certainly the case in Washington, certainly more in Washington, this is a deliberate choice, that this is a pivot by the Gulf states to Russia and to China. It's not a political choice. They don't want to be forced to make a choice themselves on terms set by the West. And I understand that entirely. But ultimately, the Saudis invite Zelensky to have the Ukraine conference in Jeddah. So they invite Zelensky. So it's not that they're not, they don't understand what's happening. But it's not a fight that they want or need at the moment. It's the same with Iran. People don't want a rapprochement with Iran. There isn't a rapprochement. It's a parking of a whole set of issues. Because they don't need this stuff at the moment when they're trying to do other things. And partly they don't need this stuff because they think the West has not been with them. Because they've not been able to rely on the support of the West over the last decade to help them achieve the things they want to do.
And just on China, China is a very, very interesting topic because actually trade between the US and China dwarfs any trade the Gulf has with China. And so it's always quite interesting when, American diplomats or officials start lecturing people in the region about relations with China. It's like, really? Well, what about you guys? It's in the, billions and billions and billions annually, and yet the Gulf is supposed to hurt its own interests by not having a relationship with China.
I was going to say, let's talk about the dragon in the room, China, and its sort of gravitational pull it seems to exert on BRICS countries. And we're going to have to find a much longer acronym, I think, as more and more countries join BRICS. Is this something the West should be worried about? Is it heading towards de-dollarisation and the undermining of the West's ability to globally police the world through sanctions? Should the West be worried, or is this just a development that can take place alongside the traditional structures of NATO and the West? Mina.
Okay. I was going to say, John, do you want to take that? Look, I think de-dollarization is something that has been spoken about for years. It's definitely an arm of the strength of the U.S. at a time that we see that the U.S. is not as domineering as it used to be, although I agree it's still the largest and most influential of the superpowers. I do think the speed with which sanctions were imposed on Russia and how quickly everybody kind of rallied on that point was a moment in different parts of the world. The countries thought, hold on, do we really want to be in such a weak position that we can be locked out? So I do think there is a moment that the conversation around sanctions and dollars has taken more more of a serious tone than it had before. So that's one element, yes, for sure. I think there is that conversation, but I don't think it's happening anytime soon. If it does happen, it will take many, many years, but again, you're seeing these relationships that are being built where a bilateral agreement might be made on a very specific point of trade that actually we won't just use the dollar, we'll use either our own currencies or so forth. So I think we're moving in that direction, part of this greater move where that moment of globalization, capitalism is the world, the post-Cold War moment, the end of history moment where for a brief moment it seemed like the dollar was the currency of the world. I think we're definitely moving away from that, and it is reflective of American foreign policy, reflective of the fear of America's dominance. When it wants to, it can really wield that power. But I would say also on sanctions, there have been many examples of the failure of sanctions regimes. Talking about Iran, but we also talk about Iraq. What happened from 1990 until 2003. Sanctions destroyed Iraq in many ways, but actually didn't weaken the regime. And there are question marks about how sanctions are used.
John, you've been nodding.
Yeah, I mean, sanctions can work in certain specific circumstances, but they're quite often a blunt instrument. And I think one of the things they've done in the Middle East is help criminalise it, make economies criminal. You saw it in Iraq and the Sudan, where there is all sorts of ways to generate dollar earnings, to false invoicing, to smuggling oil, and so forth. And you see this across the region. You see it in Iran in particular. It's one of the reasons why Iran has become such a major player in global criminal networks, because that's the way in which they protect their own economic interests.
I'm going to interrupt to say, if not sanctions, then what? Because there'll be a lot of people in the audience who say, well, look, you've got to sanction Russia for what it did in Ukraine. You've got to exert some kind of penalty. If not sanctions, what works?
What will work with Russia is Russia losing in Ukraine. But that's the argument. Because Russia has been Putin has been a revanchist power for at least the last decade, probably more. And if there wasn't a decisive victory in Ukraine, they would come back for more, sure. And this is the argument the Baltics make, is the argument the Poles make.
So you're saying a bit more muscularity over Russia?
My view, yeah. And I think an issue about, with China and Namibia and so forth, they do some trades in Namibia. Those are generally point-to-point trades. Actually, all those trades are effectively in dollars themselves. Unless the yuan becomes fully convertible currency, essentially nothing reserve currency, it's hard to see that de-dollarisation will accelerate. There's been some withdrawal of Saudi, there's been a drawdown of Saudi T-bill holdings, but there's been a general drawdown of T-bill holdings over the last 2 or 3 years, which is a reflection of, I think, balance of trade and trade flows. It's there, people talk about it. I think the Americans are probably concerned. They probably think it's a slow puncture, if it's anything.
And the SWIFT mechanism. So there's talk. Just generally.
The SWIFT actually was the thing, in my view, the single thing, the right of other things. It was the thing that eventually convinced Khamenei to agree to the talks, the secret nuclear talks in Amman with Dick Sullivan and Bill Burns. Because big cut-off in the international financial system meant that they were blocked from accessing dollars and euros, basically everything. That was the thing. So that did have an impact. And that introduced the JCPOA, which of course we all know the history of that. So it was,
And briefly, to turn to the one of the eyes in BRICS now, where does India stand on all this? Will the India-Gulf corridor make any distinct difference? Is that a stand against Russia? Where's India, Mina?
India's really interesting. The UAE just signed something that they call CEPA, which is the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, which is another way of saying an FTA, but not. And that's hugely important because India actually looks to the Gulf not only for its energy needs, but also, funnily enough, as a conduit to Africa. And so there are all sorts of ties that are being formulated between Asia and Africa that isn't about US versus China, even though it's often framed that way, but that actually there's a lot in terms of trade, in terms of, great rising middle classes, but also again, to the point that strategic interests meet. And so I think India has also been really important, as has actually Indonesia, in saying we don't want to go into the non-aligned movement as such, but we don't want to be constantly forced to choose. Is it between America and China? Is it between Europe and Russia? We don't want to be caught in this. So India plays a very important role in that, in saying we still have very good ties with the US because it's important to us, and we will, they have a tense relationship with China, but we don't want to, antagonize them, and actually want to maintain ties with Russia. And so India is an important player in that, in saying there is potentially a third way. What does that look like? But as I said, it's not India alone. It's other significant powers like Indonesia, to a certain extent Malaysia. Turkey's interesting, NATO member, and yet also saying, hang on, I can have my own foreign policy.
Kind of something, I mean, from 1820 onwards, the Gulf states, as they became, were administered from Bombay, as it was, and they were part of the Raj. They were never administered from London, and that lasted certainly until 1948. And in many ways, the Gulf states still look that way. I mean, Basra had a huge, back in the day, a huge Parsi community down there. I mean, the trade was down to Bombay. That's a natural corridor. India, being a member of BRICS, of course, with China, means that the BRICS has limited room for manoeuvre in developing independent system of global governance or trade regimes and so forth, because they are rivals. I think this recent issue about the trade corridor is really interesting. There's very little detail about what it exactly would mean, whether it takes in Oman, or whether it comes through Fujairah, or through the eastern province, into Jordan, and then into Israel, Beit-Shan, and actually it's a really interesting concept. And not least because I think actually, given the nature of the Middle East, a lot of freight is far more secure transported over land than it is through the choke points of Hormuz or the Bab al-Mandab or Suez Canal. It's a really interesting. The other thing about it is a massive probe of Turkey. Right? You've got Erdogan's reaction to it. Nothing can move without going through Turkey. Well, yeah, okay, maybe not. We'll see. That was, I apologise to the gentleman, but it was fun.
Now, before I turn to audience Q&A, I'm just going to ask you, sort of in a sense, for a brief wrap-up. We've had a little bit of pessimism. We've talked about short-termism, the downside of democracy, particularly just recently, turbulence. Are there things that the UK can easily and realistically do that would turn around the perception of us in the Middle East? Should the Foreign Office be doing anything differently? Should it have different priorities? Can ministers do different things? What realistically can we do? And Mina, I'll come to you first again.
Okay. A number of things. I genuinely do think having a minister at the FCDO that is just focused on the Middle East gives a signal of there's one, again, address, there's one person to come to. We had Alistair Burt here. I didn't say it when he was here, but now that he's not here, I can say it. And he was incredible when he was Minister of the Middle East North Africa. There was one person, he built those relationships. He was constantly in the region. People like that faith anywhere in the world. Sometimes talking about, in the Middle East, they like to see face-to-face. Everybody likes that. You build a relationship with trust and so forth. So
and does continuity matter?
Continuity does matter. And he was one of those people that was in his position for quite some time and came back to it. So I think that's kind of clear message and signaling. And of course, the Prime Minister at the moment hasn't had too much spare time and we all know that he's very focused on what does the next general election look like. But again, visits and presence and so forth is important. And so I would say, and that, even the royal family, we know that the royal family has very strong ties to the region, and that's something that the more that is cultivated, the more it is appreciated, especially amongst the monarchies of the region. So that's a very kind of, to the point, but, obvious thing to do. But then there's the next level, which is, visas, and what does it look like for the ease of people coming to visit or not? When you have artists being denied visas to come at major events and festivals in the UK, people question that and say, "What, you don't want us to be present when it's a well-known artist?" And again, that kind of cultural relationship that really affects people-to-people relationships. So that's another one. BBC radio, Arabic radio, 75 years. The amount of people, when the 1958 coup d'etat happened in Iraq and the end of the monarchy, everybody I spoke to from that time, I did a whole study of it, said we knew what was going on because we listened to BBC Arabic.
Yeah.
Suddenly there's no more BBC Arabic radio. When Sudan conflict broke out in April this year, the BBC had to restart its radio service because they realized how important it was to have a trusted and honest voice explain what was happening. BBC Radio closing down after all these years is impossible to understand. So I think the role of, again, these institutions of trust, universities accepting more students, again, the amount of students I know who no longer even bother to apply to British universities because you pay something close to £1,000 to apply for a student visa, whether or not you get it or not. You're likely not to get acceptance because you can't actually come and visit. Come on, British universities have so much to offer. So I would say a serious effort to show that we want these ties, that there is mutual benefit when we have these exchanges would be really important.
I absolutely agree with that. There was a well, I'm not sure it's famous, but there was one of Joe Biden's first visits to Joe Biden when Obama was given the responsibility for Iraq. And he goes to visit Masoud Barzani, and they're talking, and he says, look, I understand your pain, I understand your desire to be free of the oppression and the rest of it. I'm Irish, and I understand, I understand.
He always
I know, it's so clever. I understand, but we also hate British, and Barzani said, there's a pause, and Barzani, part of my cabinet, I've got British passports, and I think, this is, that's gold dust, actually, quite honestly. This is a function of the university, it's a function of visas, it's travel. You look at London. London's a massive asset for us. I just say to them down the forum, you don't have to travel to something, just go down up there to a road down to Knightsbridge, and you meet everybody, or in Baltimore, you see everybody. This issue of attention, paying attention. If you're an oil company, your executives are in the Gulf all the time. But they're visiting, they're building relationships, they're known. Our minister stopped doing that. Having somebody, like Alistair, and he was the last one, he was quite rare even then, who knows the people, who takes them seriously. They want to be heard as well. You can't overestimate this. You really can't. I think the issue of universities is massive because the number of people in the Middle East who have been educated in British universities. I think helping. There are British universities in the Gulf, British universities as well. I think if you look at the way there is clearly a massive gap in the market in the Middle East as a whole for educational institutions, particularly tertiary education and improving standards in the rest of it. And that's a big thing. I think traditionally it would have been a thing for the British Council. I think to a certain extent the British Council lost their way as well, actually. I think they focus on the right things. And then, it ultimately comes back to the question, how much do we think the Middle East matters to us? And that's a much bigger question. I think it matters a lot. There was a great piece, I think in Foreign Policy and Foreign Affairs this week by Robert Gates, who was called second one of George W. Bush, which makes the case for the Middle East mattering to the United States, Middle East mattering to the United States, against people like Walter Mearsheimer, John Mearsheimer, Stephen Watt, who say it doesn't matter. The only thing about it is great power conflict, and we should focus on that. Which I think is, I would use the phrase that came to mind, but I think it's contestable.
One final thing I want to ask, and obviously we have a fine example of it here. We've got a lot of ex-diplomats, ex-military personnel who know the region extremely well and are known in the region extremely well. Yeah. Do you think we can make better use of that repository of experience, expertise, and wisdom?
If they pay enough money, sure, but it's. But also, that's important. I'm going to say it's important. If you look at the demographics of the Middle East, it's overwhelmingly young. And you look at the energy in the Middle East, this is the thing that strikes me, the artistic energy, the desire to get on, the desire to succeed, economic, it's massive. It's that, you don't know people like me or Chris.
So you're saying you're past it.
You do want younger people, it's that strikes me, because they're the future.
Thank you. On that note, can I open it up to our audience? There's going to be quite a few hands. I'm going to take 3 questions at a time, and if I miss you, just wave aggressively and I will eventually find you. So I'm going to take gentleman there, gentleman at the back, and then you, sir, there. Yes, you sir. Keith, yeah.
Keith Best, I'm a former MP. I just wonder if subliminally we've not been over the last few years doing through like the second series.
So I might get you to repeat that just so the microphones pick it up and everyone can hear.
Thank you. I just wonder if over the last few years we've not been really through subliminally a second series, and we're repeating Dean Acheson in 1962. We've lost an empire, but yet to find a role. And I wonder if the debacle in Iraq and Afghanistan has also convinced the rest of the world that we really are just a poodle of the United States, and therefore we don't have an independent foreign policy. All this is very sad, but my question is about Iran. You mentioned Iran, Sir Ron. I was last there a long time ago in Parliament times, but it always struck me that despite the present regime, a highly sophisticated, highly educated country with a very rich history was the ideal partner for the West in a very troubled region, which has been carved up thanks to Sykes-Picot and all the rest in a way that is non-functioning in many respects. What chance is there of us ever getting some kind of rapport or rapprochement with Iran?
Then the gentleman at the back.
You see with me as King Charles, the best ambassador for Britain to start a new friendship, the trust and relationship has had in the past with the rulers, the kings of the Middle East. Would you agree with me?
And then finally, and I'll get you both to answer all the questions, the gentleman here.
Thank you. I could ask about lots of things. It's been a very, very fascinating conversation. But going back to something which both Mina and John mentioned early on was about ownership of sports clubs and sports washing. I'm on the advisory board of the Premier League, and we've discussed this a lot. And generally the argument tends to be we shouldn't allow sports washing. But I'm wondering what the panel think about, well, maybe if they do want to come and invest, they want to do different things, they want to be culturally more diverse than they are now, they want to clean their reputation, so why don't we, or can we, should we, flip that round and go, yes, you can sports wash, but you do that not just by spending money here, but by making changes at home. And is that a realistic thing that we can do? Is that something we ought to do? Thank you.
Thank you. So we have Iran, the role of Prince Charles, and sport. John. Oh my goodness me, King Charles.
It's a tower.
We'll pretend that didn't happen.
On the monarchy, I can't comment. It is the monarchy. The monarchy is a great asset for this country in the region. And the king has, over decades, developed a whole set of relationships in the region, which are not political. And I think that's a great thing, because you do need a space which is not political, not just because the prime ministers come and go a lot quicker these days than the East. So having a continuity. And I remember having a discussion with my Spanish colleague in Riyadh about this, and he said, well, we need to use, the Spanish monarchy more. Actually, they use the Spanish monarchy not necessarily in the right way, but for all sorts of different reasons. But there we are. Iran, the rest of it. Sykes-Picot, of course, was never implemented. You look at the lines. The nearest we got to Sykes-Picot was Daesh, actually. Was Islamic State. If you look at Islamic State now, that looks more like Sykes-Picot than anything else did. I don't think it's simply a case of the borders that were defined at SEV or as are all the sources of contention. I also said the Dean Acheson quote. Dean Acheson says it's true. This is a year after British troops have gone to Kuwait to secure Kuwait against what may or may not have been a threat from King Qasim from Iraq in those days, and only 4 years after we put troops into Jordan to stop a similar threat to the Hashemites. So Britain remained active after Syria. I think Iraq, the invasion of Iraq, has been disabling in a political way, and I think in that sense, yes, it has led to a crisis of confidence on Middle East issues in the region. Iran, there's been this illusion that Iran will be the partner of choice in the region since the Shah, my view is it won't happen with this regime, quite honestly, because they are fundamentally hostile to the West. So it's just not practical. That's my.
Okay, so agreed about.
Oh, sorry, football.
Yeah, go on.
Oh, it's football. So I say something about football. I mean, you talk about fit and proper owners of football clubs. I mean, it's not that this is a new issue in British football, in English football in particular. It's been an issue since over the last 25 years. I mean, I don't know about Fenway Sports, but it's been. I think what the Saudis are doing is what the Saudis have done. I think is not alter the nature of the sport. What they've altered is the economics of football in particular, at least for the moment. Whether that's sustained or not, I don't know. If you look at the amount of money they're spending on, they have to earmark for various projects, not just football, which represent the sport, represents a very small part of the amount of money they put into the PIF, or they have earmarked against the mega projects. But it's significant, and personally, I think what they want from football, from getting Ronaldo or Benzema or these guys, is clicks. You actually get social media coverage. That's the initial thing you want. It's not necessarily you want a domestic leagues or rival European leagues that may come sceptical for various reasons. But you're certainly getting a lot of coverage. Is that sports washing? I mean, nobody stopped talking about the things they don't like about Saudi Arabia. So I don't think, if it is sports washing, it has to work. It's certainly a way of positioning themselves as a different sort of country to the country that they say they were before 2015 and certainly before 1979. And I think it's that distinction from the past.
Mina.
Just very quickly, on Iran and rapprochement, I think that with the current regime and what it stands for, they don't seem that interested in that. But the Iranian people are the ones who are suffering the most from the current situation as it stands, be it sanctions, be it what the regime does and everything. So I agree with you. The Iranian people deserve much better and actually are not just educated with the culture they have and everything, but again, that's what makes them part of this region that is rich with culture and different histories and so forth. But I agree there's also a crisis of confidence that has emerged from the Iraq War, and that the UK kind of hasn't fully owned it. I don't think we've had the Chilcot Inquiry, we've had conversations about it in Parliament and so forth, but I think on a wider level there hasn't been an ownership of actually, but there are good things that the UK does, and that crisis of confidence needs to be gone over. Role of King Charles, hugely important. He spoke about the ties between religions and the ties between cultures before it became fashionable. And actually what he stands for and the kind of the seminal speeches he gave, the moments that he brought people together when he was Prince Charles, before becoming King Charles, was hugely important and gave an indication of what people like about the UK and being open to the world. And I think he's a great asset in that sense, and the rest of the monarchy. Ownership of sports clubs, it fascinates me that a country that allowed Chelsea Football Club to be bought by somebody who actually would have liked their money to be seen in a different light, didn't really have a problem, but has a problem when it comes to the golf. And I think this is part of that. You don't hear sports washing being used when other sources of money are being used in British football clubs. So I think it goes to that wider attitude, really, when it comes particularly to the golf. That's, almost looking down on them, unfortunately, when in reality it should be, well, yes, why is this money coming in and how has sports changed? I mean, look at FIFA. We could have a completely separate conversation about FIFA and what it's meant in terms of how money comes into football. But I think bigger question here is about that relationship through sports that I think is actually very positive. And, again, we saw with the Qatar World Cup, started very, very negative, but once the football started, actually brought people together. People had great experiences who went there, and we should encourage more of that.
Right, we have, if we're able to keep answers and questions short, we have time for some more. Chris, gentleman there, Leo, gentleman there, and gentleman there first.
Chris Bowers from Mina. I can tell you I've spent a lot of time about the ownership of Roman Abramovich in Chelsea. I'm sure there's quite a few football fans who say a lot about that as well. What I actually wanted to ask about the golf was, do you know any rich financiers who can bail out
was talking to some senior officials at the PAF the other day, including one who's an advisor to this report. I said, we've got. He said he was a Manchester United supporter, so I can miserate. And then I said, I'm a Forest supporter, but we're not very good, so you wouldn't want to buy any of our players. Sorry,
I'm going to pull this back from football, I'm afraid.
Well, essentially, I mean, there's been a lot of talk about Mohammed bin Salman. Let's assume that there's been a lot of talk about Mohammed bin Salman. Let's assume that he's halfway through his project in Saudi Arabia. What do you think he wants it to look like in 5 years' time? And what do you think he wants to do in terms of reshaping the region, say in 5-10 years' time? What's the end game?
Thank you very much. And microphone over here at the front.
I'm Leo, I'm 16 years old, I come from North East Somerset, and I was just wondering, how can we get young people in my generation,
how can
we get young people in my generation, who may be future ministers, to be more interested in international politics in the Middle East?
You tell us.
Yeah, exactly.
You tell us what would make you more interested.
And the gentleman there.
Hello, my name is Willie Sterling. I started something called the Tourism Women Project in Jordan, working with British Council to produce radio, drama, also theatre and film with Syrian refugees. And I've also got family history in the Gulf. I was a little boy. I was daddle on the knee of Sheikh Zayed bin Salman. My question is this. We spent a bit of time moaning about the decline of our influence, whether it's education, sport, a range of soft power places. Do we need to actually have a proper joined up policy, possibly governed by the Foreign Office, but with a lot of other institutions to make sure we've got more young, rising middle class students coming to Britain rather than the US, to make sure that we can get Radio Arabic back up, and Radio Persian too, but that's gone too, and it's a disgrace that that's happened. But we are allowing these things to happen. It is our will that if we want this to happen, we have to make it happen. We have to make it joined up. Other countries do this in a very different way, and we are failing on this. And after Brexit, we need to fight for our place in the world and earn our living.
Yeah, the answer is yes.
It's, the UK is ceding ground. It's ground it has, and it's willingly giving it up.
And there are two other questions as well on both MBS at the so-called end of his project, although of course Vision 2030 doesn't end there, and how on earth do we get young people involved and interested in the Middle East?
I think one of the most fascinating things about Saudi Arabia at the moment is this can-do attitude. And that we're going to shoot for the moon, and if we land amongst the stars, then we haven't done too badly. And I think that's, from what I understand from my many trips to Saudi Arabia and speaking to people who work on these various projects, it is that sense that we're in a race against time, because actually Saudi Arabia had stagnated for so long on a lot of these issues that they want to make up. And I think Mohammed bin Salman would be satisfied to a certain extent in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, if he saw that Saudi Arabia was living up to its potential, and then going, the extra mile. I think the impact on the region is huge, especially when we talk about what it means to be Muslim and not being cut off from the world. And for many, many Muslims, that's the natural state. That's how it should have been. And so actually it has a very important political and religious symbolism of what that means, but it doesn't mean that it comes without being challenged. And I don't think it's all going to be a one-line trajectory, and that's something to look out for. I think for young people in international affairs, it is part of a wider conversation about public discourse and how people are being educated, what they're learning from. So part of it is people in our stage of our lives working harder and better at making it more accessible and understandable and why it matters. But also it is, unfortunately, our part of the world, the Middle East, feels less safe, even though it is safe. So to go out and travel and experience and get excited and interested in these parts of the world, which unfortunately COVID hasn't helped, 3 years nearly of no travel, but also concerns about security, meant that people weren't as comfortable going and backpacking and learning the language, which they used to do. And I think the more we can encourage, again, universities and schools and philanthropists to put up the money and the programs that allow people to come and experience it, that more than anything else will get people excited, and then they become champions and it can spread out.
I agree with all of that. On the ABS, I think he sees himself as a refounder of the kingdom. After the long-term, he said he took 1979, and we can argue about the history of this, but I mean, there's clearly something in it. And there was stagnation, but all sorts of different ways. It's a very new way of doing things. It's no longer the traditional family with different branches owning different bits of bureaucracy. It's one man in charge. And I think he sees equally what he models himself on other refounders of states. He's very different people like Peter Blake and so on. I think this Vision 2030 is one stage, as he said in the Fox interview last week, something that's going to continue in the future. And I think what it's done is energize a lot of people, particularly young people, and it's given them a sense that there's something really ambitious. I think a lot of it's too ambitious myself, but maybe you had to have that level of vaulting ambition to get anything done, and to jolt people out of this trough that got themselves into, and particularly close down the religious discourse in the kingdom, the sort of Salafi, Wala al-Bara sort of attitude that comes out of the mid-19th century, this idea that we are alone against the world and we need to reject things that aren't Salafi, that aren't us. This new openness. I always think of Vatican II when John the 23rd said the Catholic Church needs an adjournamento. This is this opening to the world, because the Catholic Church had been closed since the mid-19th century. You open to the way you open the windows. That's what he's done. He's opened the windows. I think he needs a lot of things to happen. In particular, he needs to make Saudi Arabia a welcoming environment for foreign direct investment. But as FDI is one of the key indicators that he himself has proposed, and they're not getting enough at the moment. He needs it. So you need a whole set of other things to happen. But he's going to be there for the next 40 years, maybe long. He's the guy, and this is the direction he wants to take the country. And it has inspired a lot of Saudis. People talk about the authoritarianism like a free speech movement, all which is true, and I think a lot of this is unnecessary. But he is very popular among young people. Given when blind people think this is another sort of soft view. Actually, it's huge. If you're an ordinary Saudi family, most Saudi families are earning $20,000, $30,000 a year. It wasn't a huge amount of money. You're spending a lot of it on drivers. Now you're not, and women can go and work. You see the big female employment rate, participation rate going from 20 to 36%. It's huge. There's a lot more that needs to be done, and I think personally you probably need to dial down some of the more dramatic announcements about massive developments up in the desert. But he's changed the discourse, and that is and we were telling Saudi for years, you need to reform, you need that, and then it happens, and then people start to question things. It's in our interests. I mean, a senior Gulf leader said to me, Saudi Arabia is too important. Saudi Arabia has to succeed. And I think that's fundamental. It's in all our interests for Saudi Arabia to succeed.
John, thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much to you. You've been a great audience, as they say. If you're interested in other events that CMEC is putting on in its debate series, you will find leaflets on your seat or in front of you. If you scan the QR code, which is on there, you will be able to sign up for free, which is a bit nuts, to our daily update, briefing for MPs, but you can sign up too, which is a rundown of all the stories going on from the region and in the region. John's endorsing it. Thank you very much, John. And if you want to continue talking about Gulf states in particular, at TBI in the International Lounge, there is another event at 5 o'clock where you can continue the conversation. So to our speakers, Sir John Jenkins, Mina Al-Oraibi, and to you, the audience, thank you very much indeed.